Hello. Hello, everybody. Now we'll discuss the concept of full employment equilibrium and underemployment equilibrium. These are two concepts. I say full employment equilibrium is concept which is mostly highlighted by the classical economists, and this underemployment equilibrium, which is otherwise called less than full employment equilibrium, that is highlighted by Professor J.M. Keynes. And this is more practical. So let us understand the concept of full employment and the underemployment. And from there, because we know equilibrium. Equilibrium is what? That we have already discussed. Now, if the aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate supply, the level of income at which aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, that is called the equilibrium level of income. Now, the question, we must understand what is full employment and what is less than full employment. And if this equilibrium happens at the level of full employment, this is called full employment equilibrium. On the other hand, if this equilibrium happens at a level less than full employment, then we call it underemployment equilibrium or less than full employment equilibrium. And so far as the concept of full employment is concerned, it is a situation where all the resources, all the people, those who are able to work and those who are willing to work at the prevailing wage rate got employment. In such a situation is called a situation of full employment, or we can say it is a situation of absence of involuntary unemployment. Full employment is a situation of involuntary unemployment. And if at this situation the aggregate demand becomes equal to aggregate supply, if at this level aggregate demand becomes equal to the aggregate supply, then this is called full employment equilibrium. And regarding the validity of this concept, what the classicals have told, the classical economists, they have pointed out that if full employment equilibrium is a normal situation of an economy. That is the opinion of the classicals. The classicals who believed in a famous Say's law of market. The classicals, they believed in the Say's law of market. What does the Say's law of market say? The Say's law of market says that supply creates its own demand. And since supply creates its own demand, then whatever produced is automatically sold. Goods 100 rupees produced means 100 rupees injected to the market. So the supply creates its own demand. That is the concept of the classicals. They believed in that Say's law of market and flexibility of wage and price. So that's why on the basis of these two assumptions, the classicals, they pointed out that full employment equilibrium is a normal situation. But in 1939, during this Great Depression, Professor Keynes proved that what the classicals have pointed out, that is not at all true. And he pointed out that full employment is a concept which is not easy to find out. What is the normal situation? Normal situation can never be full employment. The normal situation is less than full employment, because Keynes pointed out that aggregate demand always falls short of the aggregate supply. Simple thing. Why aggregate demand falls short of aggregate supply? Now we have seen aggregate demand has two components, means aggregate demand depends upon consumption expenditure and investment expenditure. Again, investment, we have taken autonomous investment, and autonomous investment remains constant. That means the aggregate demand depends upon the consumption expenditure, and consumption expenditure is subject to the psychological law of consumption. And what does the psychological law of consumption say? And the psychological law of consumption says as income increases, consumption increases, but less than proportionate. And since the psychological law of consumption is this, then aggregate demand will always fall short of the aggregate supply. And because aggregate demand falls short of the aggregate supply, it will be, the normal situation will be less than full employment. The AD will be equal to S at a level less than full employment. So that's why Keynes pointed out that the normal situation is less than full employment equilibrium or underemployment. That means what Keynes says that the equality between aggregate demand and aggregate supply is always achieved at a level less than full employment. And this equilibrium is called underemployment equilibrium or less than full employment. That we can show with the help of a diagram. So this is OX axis, this is OY axis, and here along OX axis we measure income, output, and employment. And here we are going to C plus I, that is aggregate demand. We draw the aggregate supply. This is the aggregate supply curve, that is C plus S. Now, suppose say OQ is the full employment output, and to achieve equilibrium at this level of output, please listen to me. Let us suppose say in the economy the full employment income or full employment output is OQ, and to achieve equilibrium at this full employment output, which can be called as full employment equilibrium, the required aggregate demand is EQ. You require the aggregate demand equal to EQ. What we have assumed? We have assumed that, let us say, the full employment output in the economy is OQ. That means if all the resources are put into use, the maximum output that can be produced is equal to OQ. And to achieve equilibrium at this level of output, the required aggregate demand is EQ. So the aggregate demand curve should be AD. But the actual aggregate demand when the actual aggregate demand is drawn, the actual aggregate demand is AD1, and the actual aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate supply at point F. So what we find, this point E represents the point of full employment equilibrium. But as per the actual aggregate demand, the equilibrium is actually happens at point F with OT level of output, and F is the point of less than full employment equilibrium. Because the full employment equilibrium point is E, but the equilibrium actually taken place at point F. Full employment output is OQ, but our equilibrium income is OT. So that means much before the full employment output, the equilibrium is achieved. And this point F is called underemployment equilibrium or less than full employment equilibrium. That is what this concept of underemployment equilibrium. And this is the difference between full employment equilibrium and underemployment. Thank you very much. If you like this video, please subscribe so that you can encourage me to produce more such videos in future. Thank you.